Population aging and its implication for economies and financial markets. We have two experts. The first one is CAI Fang, Chief Expert of National Think Tank and Academician of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And we also have Manoj PRADHAN, Chief Economist, Talking Heads Macroeconomics, London. So Mr. Tsai is in Beijing, Mr. PRADHAN is in London. We will start with Mr. Tsai. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My topic is population aging and its implication on the Chinese economy, and also policy suggestions. So now please share my PPT. Okay, next page, please. So I would like to talk about some basic information about Chinese population. There was just the 7th national census, and there was some new information. Basically, there has not been any fundamental change comparing with our existing estimates. Next page. Okay. Here you can see that China's population is still showing a positive increase. However, if you look at growth rates, that is the number of births and also natural growth. All these growths are slowing down. Every year, a new low point is created. If you look at birth rate and also natural growth rate, after 2010, these numbers fell from the peak. And every time in the census, of course, the numbers are not exactly the same. But then I think the 7th census is of the highest quality. So the increase in population is not only considered with the past 10 years as the backdrop. I think this chart is more in line with international analysis practice. So we have 190 million people who are over 65 years old. And our population aging problem is very apparent already. And so aging rate has reached 13.5% already. Next page. This is an even more alarming figure, and that is our overall birth rate. In the past, we saw from the census that, first of all, there's information about birth rates. From the 4th census in the year 2000, we can see that birth rate was 1.22 in 2005, 1.34 as the birth rate. Last time the census was carried out in 2010, the 6th census, so the birth rate was lower than 1.2. But of course, we're of the view that there was some error in the figures, and after adjustment, the numbers have not been officially announced. So usually it was stated at 1.8 to 1.7. And now all of a sudden, we see this very low, alarmingly low birth rate at 1.3. So concerning future demographic structure, I think it is more in line with past judgment. This 1.3 birth rate is really very low. So with a birth rate of over 2, then at least the two parents can be gradually replaced over time, so to speak, with new births. And then here we are in a very low birth rate range, and it is very difficult to achieve a rebound. Next page. Birth rate is coming down in China, and population aging is a very common rhythm or pattern, as we can see in many other countries. But then there are some Chinese characteristics in our population aging. First, I think our population aging shows the fastest rate. It is expected that by 2050, our aging rate will exceed that of the advanced countries. Besides, we have the largest size of elderly population. Here you can see that Chinese population accounts for a declining share of the total global population. And for those over 65 years old, will account for a bigger and bigger share. By 2040, our elderly population will account for 26.4% of the global elderly population. So in other words, 1 out of 4 elderly persons in the world is Chinese. And the third characteristic is our aging comes faster than growing rich. So our aging is faster than per capita GDP growth. And it is also faster than in other advanced countries. Even though developed countries also experience population aging, but our rate is the fastest. So with these three unique characteristics, I think our future economic growth will meet some very special or unique restrictions and challenges. Let's take a look at China's demographic changes and population aging and see its impact on the economy. Next page. We have already experienced one turning point in population, and we are soon to see the second turning point. These two turning points cause both common and different impacts on the economy. The first turning point was in 2010. For the working population between 15 to 59 years old, in 2010, the number reached the peak. After that, there's negative growth. In the past few years, there's a decrease of a few million people in the working population. And then for those between 15 to 65 years old, there is negative growth in number. And in agricultural villages, for those 16 to 19 years old, well, every year, they are the main people who become migrant workers in urban cities after graduation. Again, for this age bracket, there is negative growth. In 2017 and afterwards, there is negative growth in the working population. So if you look at labor productivity and so on, all these affect the supply side of China. In other words, the potential growth rate of China will also be reduced as a result. By 2025 or even earlier, total population of China will reach the peak, and then after that, there will be negative growth. You can see from this chart, no matter whether you refer to theoretical case or international experience or the situation in China, we can see that when we approach the second turning point, or when the second turning point is reached, after that there will be negative growth, then actually China will experience a big blow to our economy. So after negative growth in the working population, many people will believe that there would be impact on labor productivity. Well, in the past there was excess, and later on there is shortage. When there is shortage of labor, costs will go up. And then for cost of human resources, well, it is a marginal improvement for new labor. So in that case, the improvement rate will slow down. When there is shortage of labor, then you will use capital to replace labor, and then your investment rate of return will go down. So the pace of people migrating from agricultural villages to urban centers is now slower. And then, well, in the past, that was actually a main contributing factor to an increase in productivity in China. But now the situation is reversing. So if you refer to this chart after 2010, in 2011, we projected the potential growth rate of China as shown in the red line. And actual growth rate and potential growth rate are actually in line with one another. So this shows that our projections are very accurate. More importantly, this shows that during that period of time, we did not experience any demand threat or challenge. However, once we reach the second population turning point, then the situation will change totally. Next slide, please. As we know, between supply and demand, when we do a study, the two affect one another. But we just separate the two for the sake of analysis. In the past, factors affecting China's demand also affected, factors affecting supply also affected demand. So export will go down, and then external demand will also weaken. If our economic growth slows down, investment return comes down, then capital formation will also slow down. Investment demand will also weaken. Then we are going to face the second turning point in population soon, and that means there will be negative growth in population. That will affect our consumption demand, especially residents' consumption demand. Next page, please. Overall speaking, there are 3 points affecting consumption demand. First, total population. If all other factors remain unchanged, then population are consumers. With more population, then consumption will increase. With negative growth in population, consumption will come down. There will be negative growth. Next, age structure. Under most circumstances, no matter whether we are talking about developed or developing countries or China, when age goes up, purchasing power will come down, and then propensity to spend will also come down. So that means when aging rate is going up, then our purchasing power will come down. That's why consumption is not strong. And then there's the third point. Wealthy people tend to spend less. Poor people tend to spend more. However, poor people cannot have all their demand satisfied. So as a result, they tend to save. So here, if you refer to this chart, you can see this phenomenon. Our savings are bigger than spending. And this is also in line with changes in population structure. All these are unique restrictions on our consumption and spending. Next page. How does aging affect consumption?
We had a survey for the urban population. And according to the age, we have plotted this chart from 0 of age to 100 years of age. And we look at their production returns. And we also looked at their payment for consumption. And you see that it is between 20 to 60 years of age and peaking at 30. That is their production income. But for consumption, it is not correlated to this. It is not a curve such as the income. And you see that the expenditure for consumption had been high from the start. And you can see that there is a peak at a young age for the peaking of consumption. And basically, it shows that the parents are very willing to spend on their single child or their children. And the commercial sector is also taking advantage of this, and that includes education fees and also nurturing of children costs. And this is exceptionally high. And the number of children is dropping. And you see that for the older generation, when people reach an older age, they have another pattern, and that is the income and the retirement safety and retirement fund. It is right away returned to those who deposit the retirement deposits. So that is to say, while you're in production age, you are already depositing into the social security system, and therefore it restricts your consumption. And the social security system is a concurrent system where you pay in and take out. And I do not know whether at my point of retirement, whether my security or social security is able to sustain my retirement livelihood, because we know that there will be changes and uncertainties in the future. So this generation of people will still have to adopt defensive measures to provide for their own retirement, and therefore their consumption is restricted. It is not fully released. So after for the age group that had retired, their consumption falls even further. And basically, it is the payment for medical fees. And if we take that side of payments out, it would be even lower. And this is partly because the retirement funds are insufficient. So the old age people still have to think about their future, and also they think about their posterity or even their children and their grandchildren. So they are also curbing their consumption as well. So this is a direct restriction and constriction on their consumption. So let us look at part 3, and that is, with the aging population, how do we safeguard our strategy of economic growth? There are already some policy deployment. If you look at the 14th five-year plan, and which basically points to the GDP per capita target by 2035, we would be able to, according to the World Bank levels, reach a high-income society. So we should be able to realize that, and that is by it would exceed $12,000 by in terms of GDP per capita. So China would be able to reach a new sector of countries with mid and then to high-income countries. So in coming up with this growth rate projections, there are 2 points. Whether there are certain transformation bonus, and secondly, more importantly, would demand be able to be sustained. So if we look at these charts, we see that the production rate is lowering, it's decelerating, and the reasons is because of a loose macroeconomic policy and also a loose industry policy. And we can see that at present there are two factors that are not conducive to production. One, as we have mentioned, the reform bonus is diminishing, and at the same time there is need for protection, and it comes from either the macroeconomic loosening and also in terms of the monetary loosening, and also there are some supportive policies for the industries. So for the enterprises or the companies that are not competitive, they continue to stay, they continue to be in existence. And therefore, for some of the enterprises, because they're not successful, they do not get sufficient investment or they have to exit, then this is first reflected in the manufacturing sector, and the manufacturing sector income would fall. And at the same time, you would be able to see that labor would come down for manufacturing sector, but the loose monetary policy makes investments sustainable. So there is continuous investment. And as a result, the labor productivity increases. So for the there is conflict and friction between the primary industry, secondary industry, and tertiary industry labor productivity rate, as shown in the chart. So this is not in consistency with each other, and it is therefore causing friction. So what are some of the challenges for the demand side, on the other hand? And what we need to do now? What we need to do is to increase the income of the labor, of the workers, and also to improve the distribution of income and wealth. For the consumption rate, it is relatively low related to international countries compared to high-income countries, mid-income countries, and low-income countries. There are a number of reasons to it. It also points to that we lack a big middle class or middle income group, and therefore the sustenance for continued increased consumption or the size of the consumption level is not big enough because of this. And from the experience of many countries, the primary distribution is important. And if it is the Gini coefficient, it is as low as 0.4, it is more reasonable. And for OECD countries with taxation and also transfer payment and distribution measures, the Gini coefficient had come down. And the State Council, through 3 rounds of primary distribution and redistribution, and also with social charitable measures, it is supporting the income of the country and at the same time lowering the disparity and the Gini coefficient so as to lay a good and solid foundation for future stable, sustainable development. So overall speaking, my last slide, for the supply side reform, at its core, it is a situation that stabilizes the core or the real economy, especially for the manufacturing sector, and it raises the productivity rate, and it sustains the sustainability and viability of the economy. So this is a new normal. From the supply side, there will have to be a structural reform. And from the demand side, the reform at the heart of it is to extend the people's consumption and also raise the effectiveness and efficiency of investment. And in the path of development, there will have to be further government will have to effect redistribution and common prosperity, so that on the two sides, supply and demand, there can be a new balance. So this is high level and high quality development. And also the enterprises or companies will also have to live up to their social responsibilities. So this is my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tsai, for the excellent presentation and your very deep analysis. On the internet, we have a lot of audience who are very concerned about the aging issue. We have a little bit of time here, and I would like to put some of the questions to you, or two questions to you, that we have received on the internet. Now, in the past period of time, the property market had been very hot. Now, Mr. Tsai, for the wave of aging population in China, and given the census, people over 65 years of age is already over 13.5%. And in the next 20 years, it would be the biggest wave the human race had ever seen in terms of aging, and that's happening in China. And how would this affect the property market, property prices? A lot of people in Hong Kong are very concerned about the property market and the financial market. Can you answer that question? Now, if we think linearly, if we look at only one factor, then of course, as I have mentioned earlier, the logic is that if the population are the consumers, if the population growth stops, if there are no other factors, and consumption would come down. Well, that's one line of logic. But for consumers, when we rent housing, when we buy housing, we are consumers as well. But of course, we still have to look at the China's realities, and that is our aging population has one characteristic, and that is they are not rich yet before they reach old age. So that is to say, one, for rural labor, it is 23.5% of the whole. So at the country's this stage of development, it is a particular characteristic. It means that there is still a lot of labor force that is waiting to transfer to the urban areas, and this will support our labor supply, which will support the economic growth, which will in turn supply income increase, which will engender a lot of demand. And secondly, urbanization is still not complete yet. It has not completed the historical mission. Over 60% of ordinary residents in the urban areas, compared to some of the developed countries, it is still low by at least a few percentage points. And also, as I've mentioned, this is the normally resident in urban areas population. And then we still have the hukou system. If we count only this hukou system, it would be 45-point-something%. So this is an 18% difference compared to the ordinarily resident in urban areas population, because these people do not have the hukou, and also they are not buying the housing yet. So there is, again, still room for urbanization and still room for these people who are the 260 million people that is a difference between the ordinarily resident in urban areas population and the population with urban hukou, the difference between the two, there is still this supply of people who will stimulate the economy. So the demand is sustainable for those reasons. Thank you, Mr. Tsai. And another question about innovation. We're talking about high-quality growth, and it's based on innovation. And innovation takes a lot of young people. Now, with this wave of aging, what policies should the government adopt to invigorate innovation, especially among the young people? I think, one, old people are part of the innovation population as well. At present, there are different definitions. I am also an old age person by some definitions, but I'm innovating in certain realms and in different industries and sectors. There are people like me as well. But of course, the mainstay would be the young people in innovation. And for them to extricate this capability of innovation, they will have to enjoy this bonus of innovation. And that is seen in a number of areas. One, education. There are some people in society who think that in order to lower the financial burden and also to increase a birth rate, and there should be a shorter schooling years. And I think that is a mistake because human resources is an important factor, and it is very much based upon education, the number of years of education. The longer of number of years of education would contribute more to the economic development. So this is the situation. So we have to, as much as possible, extend the number of years of education. For example, after the junior high school, there should be further extension of education that is free education provided by the government to encourage the families to, without raising their costs, allow their children to stay in the school and the education system for longer. And this is a source for young innovation. And second point, some of us have received very good higher education, but for the labor market, what they have learned is not in matching with what is needed. So more young people, I would say, are learning what they are not using in their work. So the question is how to educate and what to educate and train the labor market in so that there is a good matching of supply and demand. This is another factor, so that the young people are really able to live up to their potentials and their talents. And of course, we need innovative environment, encourage failures, learning through failures, and also be tolerant of failures, and also strike out and be enterprising. Those are very important as well. So next, let's welcome Manoj PRADHAN. Manoj, please. He is the Chief Economist of Talking Heads Macroeconomics, London.
Thank you, and thank our host, the HKMA, for this opportunity to present our thesis over here. I'm going to present the work that Charles Goodhart and I have done in our recent book, The Great Demographic Reversal. If I'm not mistaken, it has been translated into Chinese, and I'm very much looking forward to this. Our main thesis is that aging and some reversal of society will lead to inflation. This could not have been better timed, the conference, as yesterday in the United States, we have received a inflation print that has sent panic. The President of the United States has now had a statement that worries about inflation are becoming central to the debate in economics and in society. And the inflation story, I think, has gripped everyone's attention. So let me explain the way we look at this phenomenon. We believe that it is important to disaggregate inflation into three cycles. A predominant part of the inflation prints that we are seeing today are indeed COVID related, with supply shortages in the supply chain and in labor shortages that people have not been able to anticipate. We've talked about this in our book. However, while central banks do pay a lot of attention to the supply demand imbalances, we believe that they are ignoring two other very, very, very important sources of inflation that really need a lot of attention. First, cyclical inflation coming from the Phillips curve and from Milton Friedman's monetary aggregates is being disregarded at this point, even though the output gap in the advanced economies is going to increase and turn positive at an extremely rapid rate. And number two, demographic inflation, which is the thesis of our book. Unlike conventional wisdom, we argue that aging societies will become inflationary, not deflationary. And that is what I will address first and come back to cyclical and COVID-related shortages second. Our main argument about demography is that demography, along with some reversal of globalization, will reverse inflation. There are three historic demographic transformations that led to inflation falling over the last 30 or 35 years. We are all quite familiar with them, so I won't spend too much time with them, but I want to point out some nuances. Number one, this is the chart of working age populations in the advanced economies in blue and in Eastern Europe and China. Professor Tai has done an absolutely stunning job earlier explaining China's demography, which makes my job much easier, so it's wonderful to go after him. But the important thing in this chart is that in around 1980, the effective labor force of the world was only the blue line. But around the time that China entered the global system, starting from the 90s, with it being given MFN status in the United States, it became a real strong influence on global manufacturing. And so the effective labor supply in the world became the blue line plus the yellow line. And that series of adding laborers from the yellow line to the blue line led to perhaps the most dramatic labor supply shock that we have ever seen in history. The only thing we can think is comparable to this is the Black Death, which wiped out 25% of the world's labor supply and led to a dramatic increase in wages. That's the scale we're talking about. Second, and I won't spend much time on this because it has already been discussed, an internal migration within China was a huge driver of China's rise and its ability to transform capital and opportunity into output and lead China to where it is. But the third one has also not been paid as much attention as it should. In the advanced economies and in many emerging market economies, over the last 50 or 60 years primarily, the participation of women has increased tremendously. This is a statistic about the United States, but it can be applied to many other economies, where from the 1960s onward, the participation rates of women in the labor force increased tremendously. Now, what is important out of all of these is that their ability to provide this demographic shock into the future is very, very, very much suspect. We have already seen that global population has, the working age population has reached its peak globally. Professor Tai has told us wonderfully what is happening to Chinese demography and the difficult problems that policymakers will have to grapple with over the next few decades. And over here, clearly having reached very high participation rates, women's participation, at least in the advanced economies, has reached a peak. It may go much higher in emerging market economies, and therein lies an opportunity and a risk. So how do we deal with this when these demographic stories start flatlining or reversing, as we see in many cases? How will the world react? Well, let me give you some intuition behind why we think that demography is inflationary. Let's say there are only 3 people in the world. Frightening thought, but let's say there are only 3 people in the world. All 3 people will consume. So when they consume, thinking in very simplistic terms. They will try and, the consumption will lead to demand for a given set of goods and services that they can't do anything to replace, which means just the act of consumption by itself is inflationary. Now, out of the three, let's say two people work. As Professor Tai also said, you have two things that you have to consider for workers. Number one, first of all, a worker is almost always going to be paid less than the value of his or her marginal product. Otherwise, there would be no point in employing this person. And second, as was the debate about retirement and savings, you tend to consume less than you have in your hand as disposable income because you tend to save for the future. And so overall, workers turn out to be deflationary or at least disinflationary. Now, the proportion of people working is important. While you have 2 out of 3 working, it is relatively easy to reduce the consumption and inflationary print of all 3 people. But now let's reverse the scales. If you have 2 out of 3 people not working, they are dependents, they purely consume but don't produce, the ability of that one person who is working to offset the inflationary impulse of all 3 suddenly becomes a lot less. If you look at these the dependency ratio chart, you will see what I mean. The dependency ratio, as we all know, is the ratio of people who are not working, so the young and the old, divided by the number of people who are working. And over the last 3 decades, the dependency ratio has gone down very sharply in the emerging market economies. We've seen rapid periods of growth for them. But now what is changing is in the advanced economies, that dependency ratio is going to rise. And you may look at these other lines and say, well, the emerging markets will offset it. But as Professor Tai told us, North Asia and Eastern Europe is aging extremely rapidly. The parts of the global economy that will remain young include sub-Saharan Africa, India, and a few other countries. These countries are important, but they do not make up the bulk of global manufacturing and global output growth. So the vast majority of the world's economies are going to age when you look at their economic footprint. And that is why the mix between where economies are dominated by older people and hence become more inflationary and where they're dominated by young people and remain inflationary is important. The more concrete channel to inflation, we believe, is through a political economy channel. Professor Tai also pointed out that in China, when you get older, you do tend to save more and your consumption patterns drop. That's a very interesting point, but it's also a point that is a point of divergence between the emerging market economies and the advanced economies. In the emerging market economies, I think it is relatively inexpensive for elderly people to consume because you tend to live with your families, because looking after the elderly through the domestic labor force is cheaper. I'm going through some of this with family members of my own in India, and I can see the dramatic difference when my father, for example, travels over to see me when he had the opportunity to, and we had to provide some care for him. In the advanced economies, consumption increases into old age. And as we have seen from the COVID crisis, the consumption and healthcare needs of the elderly are extremely important from a political economy point of view. Governments cannot and should not and will not be able to ignore the needs of the elderly population. As you become older, one thing this chart does not show you is that the incidence of neurodegenerative diseases becomes extremely high. It's a difficult statement to make, but thus far, we have dealt with diseases that kill us relatively quickly. Heart disease and cancer are very, very early killers of human beings. But as we age, the diseases that we will catch, which will be neurodegenerative, do not really end life. They prolong, they allow life to go on, but they require more and more help. So out of the demographic statistics that you see, you must consider that a larger and larger proportion of working age people will be required to look after the elderly. This is not something robots can do. An experiment into nursing homes in Japan has already told us this. What is also unique about the population needs of the elderly is that governments will therefore have to take on debt. This is a chart from the Congressional Budget Office of the United States, which shows you very clearly that debt in the United States and in other advanced economies related to aging is not going to come down. So how then will we deal with debt? Well, growing would be nice, it would be wonderful, but it's very unlikely. I think, yes, productivity growth will rise because the shortage of workers will encourage firms to take on more capital and raise labor productivity, even though capital productivity may fall. Taxation, well, that's already been tried in a few places. President Macron has had a very difficult time selling one tax that any economist would agree on, which is a carbon tax. Professor Putin, who is incredibly popular in Russia, had a very difficult time raising the retirement age, which brings us to inflation. We think this is an unattractive but necessary option. It would be a main reason to think about inflation as a solution. It's what Milton Friedman all those years ago said is taxation without legislation. The question in it then that we are looking at today, won't central banks simply hike interest rates in order to control inflation? Well, they may try to, but I think aggressively raising interest rates will be extremely difficult. And the reason for that being just the chart I had shown you earlier, the incredibly high level of debt, particularly government debt that we have in the world today, means that raising interest rates will make financing that debt very, very, very difficult. There is an argument that you may not need to raise interest rates by much because the level of debt means the sensitivity of the economy to even small changes in interest rates has gone up. So the argument, the counter argument to our thesis is that debt is so high that you can raise interest rates by only a small amount. That will lead to a pretty quick reduction in growth rates, all reasonable up to now, and that will then lead inflation lower. However, our counter argument to this story would be that this type of thinking ignores the fact that the sacrifice ratio itself may change. The sacrifice ratio is what economists call the amount by which growth has to fall in order to bring inflation down to a certain level. If the sacrifice ratio is changing because of the 3 cycles that I showed you, then you may actually need growth to go much lower. And partly that is because inflation is becoming a structural story. Let me now talk about things that are more pertinent to where we stand at present. One of the biggest issues is how do we argue against the pushback that we have had? And in the interest of time, I may go over some of this quickly. We can come back to it in the Q&A. The first is, well, if growth is lower, why should inflation also not be lower? This is a mix of thinking between cyclical and structural stories. In a cyclical economy, when aggregate demand falls, you create a negative output gap. There is slack in the economy and inflation comes down because people are not working as much. In a structural story, demography leads to potential output growth slowing down. So there is no real slack. It's just that the economy is operating at a much, much, much lower level that is optimal. So you need not have a deflationary impulse. Second, why didn't it happen in Japan? If aging is inflationary, we should have seen it in Japan. The problem here is thinking about one economy at a time. We need to and we must think globally. I've been a little cheeky here. I've taken 6 charts from my book and I've just removed the country names. One of them is Japan. But what I want to show you is that Japan was no different from many other parts of the world, in fact, the rest of the world. China's disinflation, its important entry into the global trading system, led to this massive disinflation. And that massive disinflation was imported by every country in the world. It wasn't just Japan. So Japan is not unique. Japan was able to actually recognize China, as I'll show you later on. But Japan's debt, for those of you who want to know the answer, it's the upper right-hand side with the debt ratios at 250. No other country actually has that. Japan did not look very different. In fact, Japan understood that China is a massive change in the global economy, And instead of producing at home, Japan produced aggressively abroad. Its direct outbound FDI in both the manufacturing and the services sector went up dramatically. And rather than looking at the Japanese corporate sector as being reduced to a very slow point because of its debt, I think we have to look at the Japanese corporate sector as an incredibly dynamic one, which understood China and invested heavily abroad. In the interest of time, I will skip a slide to answer one final pushback that we have had very recently from Jackson Hole. Mian, Straub, and Sufi argued that the savings associated with inequality, the rich tend to save a lot, their savings go into financial markets, and those savings tend to bring down interest rates, are more important than demography and will keep interest rates lower. Conversation with our host, Mr. Hongyi, actually raised a very good point that what they're trying to explain is an impact of globalization, which has already happened. And our argument about demography is just starting. What we see is that the decline in R star, the equilibrium interest rate that Mian, Straub, and Sufi talk about, has happened in the past and is related to China. So the chart on the right-hand side shows you how manufacturing employment in the United States went down after China received most favored nation status because China could make those more efficiently, and the goods were then shipped back into the United States. So what has happened is inequality has risen within the United States for the same reason that inequality has fallen globally. The rise of China, this dramatic table on the right-hand side shows you how the ratio of workers' wages between the United States and China changed by a factor of 7. In 2000, that ratio was 35 times. By the time we came to 2018, it had fallen to 5 times. And China was involved in the part of global manufacturing that directly competed with the middle segment of the American income distribution. So on the left-hand side, what you see is a chart that tells you that the top 1% and the top 10% of the United States economy became richer, not in an absolute sense, but because the lower part of America's population was challenged by globalization and could not sustain income gains. So what we are trying to argue in there is that rising inequality and falling global inequality are two sides of the same coin. They are both explained by demography, by the global demographic story that we are talking about, and we should not think of them very differently. So now the question is, well, all that's very well and good, but we have not been able to generate any inflation for the last 30 years. Demography is one story. What about cyclical stories? And over there, I want to talk about a few things. I will skip a few slides. I'm going to skip this slide and go to the next one, in which we believe that one of the serious errors in policy making that is currently being made is to think of the Phillips curve as dead. On the left-hand side, I have an estimate from the St. Louis Fed of the Phillips curve. This shows you how the relationship between unemployment and inflation has changed. In 2019, and I purposely selected a number before the pandemic, in 2019, the Federal Reserve argued through econometrics that the relationship had flattened to a point as that slope becomes less and less negative. Lower unemployment leads to less and less inflation. It's come to a point where very low unemployment may not lead to much higher inflation. On the right-hand side, we argue that China had a very important role in disinflating the global economy. So if China's inflation is important in the US Phillips curve, but China is no longer as disinflationary as it was, the Phillips curve in the United States is probably alive and kicking. I will skip one more slide to perhaps, I think, one of the most important slides for monetary policy. Most central banks argue that as long as they keep inflation expectations under control, they don't have a problem. In these two very, very simple slides, we argue that actually inflation expectations are more backward-looking than forward-looking. The blue line over here is the 5-year inflation expectations from the Michigan Survey of Consumers, which is conducted as a survey in the United States. And we said, look, let's take a look at CPI. So we took a look at US CPI inflation, and we took a 5-year average forward, which is on the right-hand side, and a 5-year average backward, which is on the left-hand side. I think for me, we did a lot of econometrics also, but you don't need it to see that inflation expectations, the blue line, can be explained very, very, very clearly by a backward-looking CPI. Consumers look back and therefore are able to form inflation expectations, which means central banks may have it the other way around. They think if they control inflation expectations, they control inflation. Actually, it may be if they control inflation, then they will be able to control inflation expectations. And as the last few slides, I will show you two parts to higher inflation that we should think about today. Number one, the labor market has done very different things in the manufacturing and services sector. A recent BIS paper shows you that in the low contact industries, where people know who they're sitting with and who they're contacting and don't really have to meet too many other people, wages have gone up and employment has gone up. And it looks like a demand shock. In the high contact sectors, which have been really heavily disturbed, they look risky from an economic point of view and even perhaps a health point of view, wages have gone up, but employment growth has gone down. So what you see on the right-hand side is that that little thin green line is services inflation, which has not really increased. But now think about the next few months. If COVID-related inflation, if you remember my first slide, if COVID-related inflation is to come down, we need the supply side to improve. If we need the supply side to improve, we need people to come back and work there because services are employment-oriented, at least at this point. If we get people to come back, we will be incentivizing them with high wages. As employment catches up, the product between wages and employment, which is the wage bill of the employer, will go up. And it's very likely that even though COVID-related inflation comes down, this costflation from hiring more people at higher wages starts going up. Something permanent has changed in the labor market, and we will not be able to go back to life the way it was. And finally, the second channel is housing. There has never before been a house price boom this early in a recovery, not even an expansion, across 20 or 30 large advanced and emerging market economies. And why is that? Well, because I'm home, many of you may be home. And so some of the things that we used to spend on services on an everyday basis have accumulated into forced savings. And we have to decide, is the shock permanent? Is it temporary? Milton Friedman tells us that if the shock is permanent, we'll consume it. If it's temporary, we'll save it. Now, housing is the one commodity that allows us to consume and invest. We are all in the same storm. We are just in different boats, but we are all reacting to the same storm that way. Housing has gone up. Construction levels have gone down because of restrictions on supply. Once housing construction starts rising, you might well see owner equivalent rent and rent started being pulled upward for inflation. So I think the inflation story has more legs to it. It will persist for longer than most central bankers think. It will be with us next year, and it could be higher than you think. I will conclude very simply, skipping one slide, by saying inflation is here. I think inflation will be very difficult to get rid of. Number two, the last 30 or 35 years have created an impression that we have managed to handle the Phillips curve and we have it under control. I don't think that's the case. Number three, green investment is coming. It has to come. It must come. And when it does come, it will be inflationary for a variety of reasons. Number four, inequality will fall. That is the best news we have in our thesis. Productivity will be higher. The working class will regain some bargaining power. It would have been better if it was with high growth, but that's something that we have to take. Number five, the clash that we are seeing between central banks and governments is only just beginning. For the last 30 or 35 years, governments were very happy to give central banks independence. Why wouldn't you? If interest rates are falling, house ownership is going up, asset prices are rising, employment is strong, everything is good, the central bank is doing exactly what any incumbent would want for re-election chances. Now, if inflation starts rising and central banks find that as public enemy number one, it puts them in direct conflict with governments that may want to get elected. And this is an issue that many advanced economies are already facing, with friction between the central bank and the governor. And I think it is only just beginning. The biggest risk to our thesis is that central banks do not realize that the regime has changed under their feet. They fight the last war. They hike interest rates aggressively. They run into the wall of debt. We get a severe bout of debt deflation, and then inflation structurally resumes again. It's a very difficult thesis that I'm presenting to you. I hope everyone sees a little value in discussing this further. Only through discussion can we begin to deal with it. But that's it from me. I will turn it back to our host.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manoj. Thank you. Your presentation is very clear, although your view is a bit different from the traditional view that people understand. Say, for example, if I can summarize, you agree that the demographic slowing down, but the demographic change, the population getting old will slow the potential growth. But at the same time, you argue the real interest rate will actually go up, the inflation will go up. So this view, of course, if people like think carefully, you are right theoretically. Say, for example, if people are getting older, they might spend more. They have more, say for example, expenditure that need to take care of their, say, health care, all these other things. Maybe they need somebody to take care of them. So it's not certain that population get old, the consumption is getting smaller. So you certainly have a very valid point. Now, I want to follow your last part of your presentation. You say inflation actually is going up. You can see last night the U.S. number has come out. The inflation actually went up, and the housing price in the U.S. is getting crazy. Do you see, given this situation, will the Federal Reserve will raise the rate very quickly eventually? Because right now the Fed seems to be hesitating. But at a certain point, if the inflation goes out of control, then they have to take dramatic actions. That will have a big impact on the financial market, especially like the Hong Kong, which is a financial center. We'll just see your view. Thank you.
Mr. Young, thank you very much. Your question is very welcome. Let me answer it in two ways: what I think they should be doing and what I think they will end up doing. I think the focus on tapering is very difficult. Is a very difficult one. The Federal Reserve's argument has been that it wants to finish tapering first and then hike interest rates. I would almost say that tapering could be delayed or even not done. Quantitative easing could carry on while hikes are rising. Now, the tapering option that we need to finish tapering first and then hike interest rates, so reducing the increase in the balance sheet, not buying new bonds all the time, that needs to come to a flat line and then hike interest rates, made sense in the last crisis, where the central bank was the dominant player in the economy. Its quantitative easing measures were the key monetary policy and, in fact, policy option. This time, we are in a regime of fiscal dominance. We are not in a regime of monetary dominance, which means that the largest supplier of bonds in the world and in the US economy, the government, is going to raise issuance. If you remember my chart on debt, that is something that will not end for a while. It's very difficult to contain a situation in which the biggest buyer of those bonds, the biggest institutional buyer, which is the Federal Reserve, is going to stop saying, I will stop buying any new bonds, and I will then start hiking interest rate. That is a serious double whammy, a huge mismatch between supply and demand of one of the most important securities in the world. And I think that adds to financial stability. I would have liked to see them hike interest rates before tapering or during tapering, or maybe not even taper at all. That would have been the more prudent way to go about it, especially because it has been incredibly hard to calibrate the impact of tapering and quantitative easing on growth directly. We are far more comfortable dealing with the calibration of what happens when you raise interest rates 25, 50, 100 basis points. We know how that formula works. We should have stick with what we know very well and then start introducing the unknown. Now, what will they do? I think there is the chance that they have to go faster. A lot of this supply-demand imbalance is not going to go away. In fact, seasonal adjustment has no way of really dealing with supply constraints of this kind, of the participation rate suddenly changing, of supply chains globally changing, which means these inflation numbers, I think for the next 2 or 3 months, because of the Christmas period spending, will go up. The advanced economies have opened up. I'm in London. I was out for dinner yesterday, and the city is heaving. There is a lot of activity, which means those services businesses are also creating demand at a time of supply shortages. I think what they will have to do is they will have to think about whether they can accelerate their tapering if it persists, or hike as soon as the tapering is done. But they need not panic. This is not a emerging market economy, which markets feel that they have to drive. So the Federal Reserve can start talking about raising interest rates a little bit faster, and actually that's very much more beneficial because research from the Federal Reserve and from our intuition would tell us that if you raise rates a little bit earlier, you don't have to raise them as aggressively. I think what really matters for financial centers, what matters for emerging markets, what matters for the global economy is that we don't enter a year in which the Federal Reserve is panicking, raising interest rates so aggressively that we raise the risk of a global crisis one more time. We would much rather have them raise interest rates slightly earlier, do so in a more deliberate fashion, in a slower fashion, where the world has a chance to absorb what is going on. And the only thing I would also argue is that if you look at emerging markets, they have already been forced to raise interest rates fairly dramatically. So the risk premium that markets demand from emerging markets need not be provided exactly when the Federal Reserve hikes. It can be provided in advance as long as it's kept over there. So the pain has been taken by the world in anticipation because we're all in the same storm. Inflation has gone up for everyone, and we've been forced to deal with it.
So follow-up question is, last year, the U.S., the U.S. has a very high government debt because of the low interest rate. So the last year, the federal government interest payment was $500 billion, which is smaller than the year before, which is $550 billion. But you think this high debt of the U.S. federal government will constrain the Federal Reserve for rate hiking?
I think it constrains the Federal Reserve not in the lower stages of where interest rates are. It does constrain them, however, from raising rates as quickly as maybe they think they can. So some time ago, the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Clarida, had a comment that if inflation rises up very quickly, we know how to deal with it. I mean, his point was we have a variety of tools, including interest rates, that can be deployed to deal with inflation very quickly. I just don't think that's possible. If you think about very rapid increases in interest rates, the United States may be able to deal with them. Perhaps it's possible. But what we have seen every time in this globalized world is when something has changed on the interest rate space very quickly. Initially, the US has no problem with it, but the world does. When the world catches a cold, now the US also catches that cold again. The reverse feedback loop from the world back into the United States has become increasingly more important. And what could be greater evidence of this than the supply chains that are pushing inflation in the United States? I think they will have a tough time dealing with that higher government debt if they start to raise interest rates very quickly.
I see. In your presentation, you mentioned that China was a big deflator for the global economy. Now, China, as well as India, also benefit a lot from globalization. Given the trend of the global trend of deglobalization, or people have become more conservative in terms of, the political situation. Different countries are getting the popular movement, make it, the conservative movement, make it extreme. Are you worried about it, that kind of trend of the deglobalization, the impact to the world economy?
I am, and profoundly worried about it because it constrains our ability to be flexible in two ways. Number one, obviously, Immigration is not an open policy for anyone. So if you've got an aging population and you want to have people from the more populous parts of the world coming to help you, I think that opportunity is extremely limited. But think about what deglobalization also means. For example, in the United States, if we saw higher output per hour, we would say that productivity is rising and that is disinflationary. But what if that higher output per hour is coming from a factory that used to be located in China or in India and now is being located in Tennessee or Alabama? What happens then is that you, from a national standpoint, you increase the capital per labor ratio in the United States. Output per worker goes up, output per hour goes up, productivity should rise. However, from a firm's point of view, the reason that the factory was in China or India or wherever it was because they thought that was the most cost-effective and most efficient option. That was a global first best solution. If you are moving your production facility back to the United States for a second best reason, which might be deglobalization, geopolitical risks, or just supply chain risks, then you are deploying a second best, and a second best cannot be as profitable, which means that any increase in that facility in Alabama or Tennessee or wherever it is, some of those increased costs must be shared with your consumer. I think we are making ourselves less efficient. I think we are making ourselves move against the principle of openness that we had taken on. And the increase in local facilities, even though it helps local workers, actually hurts them because you do have to share those higher costs. I think it's a very difficult transition that we are going through. And I think we will see inflation coming out of that process as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Manoj Ji. So let's stop here, end this session. I hope someday you can come to Hong Kong to visit us.
It will be a great pleasure.